Have you ever imagined what it is like to beg for a single drop of water and receive only the laughter of the one holding the bucket as an answer? Have you ever thought about feeling the sun burning your skin, your muscles locked by the wood, your throat as dry as stone, while your eyes watch life dripping onto the ground, drop by drop, right in front of you? That was the reality of thousands of men and women who knew the tronco, a wooden prison where there was no time, no mercy, nothing but pain. They simply called it the tronco. A piece of dark wood, cut, polished, reinforced with iron, turned into an instrument of torture. It was not only meant to punish, it was meant to humiliate, to crush the soul, to teach everyone watching that the life of an enslaved person was worth less than the ground they worked on. Whoever was taken to it stopped being a person and became a spectacle of suffering. In front of the tronco, there was no defense. The neck locked, the arms immobilized, the body exposed to the sun, the rain, the insects, the overseer's contempt. But the worst was not the physical pain, it was the thirst. A thirst that did not kill quickly, but slowly, corroding the spirit, tearing out pleas no human being should ever need to pronounce. The scene was so brutal that even those who watched felt trapped, their souls chained to fear. This video will take you inside that story. A story many tried to erase, but that survived in the memory of those who suffered, those who resisted, those who refused to forget. In the next few minutes, you will hear accounts that may seem unbelievable, but they were real. You will feel the weight of the wood, the heat of the sun, the despair of thirst, and above all, you will understand how a simple piece of wood turned into a symbol of one of the greatest brutalities in our history. Prepare yourself. What you are about to hear is not easy. It is cruel, it is painful, but it is necessary, because only by facing the past head-on can we understand the scars we still carry in the present. The tronco was not just an instrument of punishment, it was the living portrait of dehumanization. And today, I'm going to tell you the truth that history tried to hide. They say fear has a smell, and on that day, the air felt heavy, mixed with sweat, smoke, and the strange fragrance of freshly cut wood. The enslaved people of the mill gathered in silence, their eyes curious but full of dread, while the overseers dragged a huge piece of dark wood into the yard. At first, it seemed like just a rough trunk, hastily carved, but soon everyone realized something was wrong. It was not a simple fallen tree. It was an instrument, a trap, a prison. The white men surrounded the object as if presenting a novelty. Some laughed, others kept a serious face, as if standing before a work of cruel ingenuity. The tronco had narrow openings, reinforced with iron, from which rusty points protruded. It was heavy, coarse, but at the same time calculated. It was designed to hold the neck, the arms, and sometimes even the legs of whoever dared to defy the rules. It was as if someone had dedicated time and effort to turning wood into pain. The enslaved exchanged glances, trying to guess what it meant. No one dared to ask, but deep down, everyone already knew. It could not be anything good. The silence was broken by a dry crack. The overseer struck the tip of his whip against the ground and announced loudly so that all could hear, "This will be the fate of anyone who dares to disobey us. This tronco will be the mouth that swallows the rebels. Here, they will learn the lesson they will never forget." A woman in the back let out a moan, as if she could foresee what was coming. She pressed a small child against her chest, her eyes filled with tears. The boy, not understanding, whispered softly, asking what that thing was. The mother, afraid, only shook her head, trying to silence him before the sound was noticed. But it was too late. The overseer was already approaching, dragging by the arm a middle-aged enslaved man, accused of having slowed his pace while cutting cane. It did not matter if it was exhaustion, hunger, or fever. To them, it was insubordination. The man was thrown to the ground, And before he could react, two overseers grabbed his arms and forced him toward the tronco. His eyes widened when he felt the cold iron around his neck. The wood closed with a dull thud, and within seconds his entire body was immobilized. The crowd watched in silence, their hearts racing. Some wanted to look away but could not. It was as if they were all hypnotized by the scene. The first scream cut through the air like a blade. It was not yet a scream of physical pain. Not yet. It was the scream of a soul that realizes, in seconds, that it has lost even the freedom to move. The man tried to pull his arms, but the more he struggled, the more the wood cut into his skin. The overseers laughed. One of them brought a jar of water close to the prisoner's lips, but instead of quenching his thirst, he let the liquid drip slowly onto the ground, forming a small stream that disappeared into the dry earth. The man tried to lick the air, as if he could steal a single drop, but there was no way. The hours passed, and the sun punished without mercy. The man's eyes began to drift, his mouth opening and closing like someone trying to breathe underwater. Every single minute was a new punishment. The other enslaved people watched with fear, but also with a strange sense of foreboding. That trunko would not be used just once. It would remain there, like a permanent shadow, always ready to devour the next. When they finally released him, his body collapsed lifeless onto the ground. He was not dead, but it seemed as though he had left his life inside that wooden prison. And it was on that day that everyone understood the true purpose of the tronco. It was not only about punishing one man, it was about warning all the others. It was a silent message that echoed far beyond the mill. You do not belong to yourselves. Your bodies serve us, and your pain entertains us. The tronco had revealed itself, and its presence would forever change the life of every single person in that place. No one would sleep peacefully again, because a single mistake, a delay, even a sideways glance was enough for the wood to close once more over another victim. Thirst begins as a whisper. At first, it is only a reminder of a mouth that needs to be moistened. Then it becomes an insistent plea. A rough tongue scraping against the teeth, a roof of the mouth that feels covered in sand. With the high sun, thirst turns into a sentence. It does not scream like the whip. It corrodes in silence, from within, stirring thoughts, confusing memory with delirium. And when the body learns that relief will not come, the mind begins to bargain with madness. A sip, just a sip, at any price. In the tronco, water was not only scarce, it was a spectacle. Sometimes, the overseers would bring a mug only to place it near the prisoner's nose, letting the fresh smell cut through the parched throat like a knife. Then, they would pour it slowly onto the earth, and the sound of that water dying in the dust was worse than the crack of the lash. There were those who cried, just from hearing the drip, 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 because every single drop that fell seemed to rip away another piece of hope. The body reacted first. The lips cracked into wounds that burned with the salt of their own sweat. The tongue swelled, taking up too much space inside the mouth. The head throbbed, the eyes burned, and the world lost clarity until it became a blur of light and dust. The heart raced, the hands tingled without being able to move, and every breath hurt as if it came from far away. Thirst in the tronco was not the absence of water, it was the constant presence of denied water, like a ghost, hovering in front of the face, never touching. There was a man who counted clouds. Locked in the morning, he would fix his eyes on the sky and name every shape he saw, a fish, a mountain, a belly, a river. When the clouds darkened, he would close his eyes for a second and smile, like someone savoring a miracle that had not yet come. But the rain almost never came, and when it did, it rarely fell in time. The wood absorbed the first drops, the iron grew cold, and the hot body trembled in the contrast. The man opened his mouth and waited, like a child. It was common for some to scrape their tongues against their own shoulders, trying to collect whatever moisture the skin could steal from the air. At night, thirst changed its voice. With the wind came the distant smell of the reservoir, of the still water hidden among the reeds. It was torture to know that only a few steps away there was a wet world, invisible and untouchable. Sometimes a companion would pass by slowly and, without looking to the sides, leave at the corner of the prisoner's mouth a thread of water hidden in a twisted cloth, a risk of death for both. If the overseer saw it, it meant double punishment. If he did not, for one single second, the entire universe fit into that drop. And the prisoner wept, not from relief, but from the courage of the one who shared the almost nothing. The women knew how to measure thirst through words. When the prisoner stopped asking for water and started asking for forgiveness, it was a sign that the mind had crossed a dangerous border. "I drank too much yesterday. I stole someone's water. I spoke out of turn," they murmured, without having done any of it. Thirst created imaginary crimes to justify real pain. And the women from afar responded with short little songs, softly, like someone rocking a baby. Hold on, the night will pass. Hold on, the morning will rise." They were not hymns, they were bridges. Words that gave the prisoner a place to stay when the body could no longer stand. The youngest overseer liked to play with a bucket and a spoon. First, he would tap the spoon against the rim, ting, 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 so that the sound spread the promise of water across the yard. Then he scooped a portion and let it trickle through his fingers very slowly, as if enjoying the shine of the liquid in the sun. One day, he poured the spoonful over an anthill. The ants rushed up in frenzy, drinking the water the man in the tronco could not touch. The laughter that was heard at that moment cut through the afternoon like a knife. Some swore that laughter still echoes even when the mill sleeps. Over time, many came to fear dreaming of water, because in the dream it came abundant. Wide rivers, waterfalls, jars clinking, and waking up was a brutal fall, back into hard wood, cold iron, and a burning tongue. Some begged to be kept awake the whole night, fearing the shock of waking with thirst, multiplied by the beauty of the dream. Others preferred the opposite. They plunged into delirium, as if choosing a sweet death, and stayed there, muttering recipes of infusions, memories of childhood wells, names of fountains and springs, like someone reciting a rosary of water. The truth is that few things broke a man more than begging for something so simple. "Give me a sip, please." There is no phrase more human, more equal in every language. Before it, there is no argument, no debate. There is only the body's urgency to keep living. By denying that phrase, the master was not only punishing, he was declaring himself God over another's destiny, deciding who drinks and who dries. And that power intoxicates. That is why the trunko was a tavern of cruelties, where the drunkenness of dominion was served. But it was on one afternoon, much like the others, when the sky pressed down like a lid of iron, that a young man dared to do what no one expected. Instead of begging for water, he spat what he did not have, dryness against dryness, and faced the overseer with inexplicable courage. His name was Joachim, and thirst that day learned that there was something stronger than itself. You will understand why. Joachim was a little over 20 years old, but he already carried on his shoulders the harshness of an entire stolen life. He was strong, quick at work, and there was a determination in his eyes that bothered the overseers. He did not smile easily, but when he did, he reminded the world that there was still light even in times of darkness. They said Joachim had inherited faith from his mother and courage from his father. It was this mixture that condemned him. That day, he had hidden a piece of cassava under his shirt. It was not just hunger, it was the boldness of sharing with the elders, who no longer had the strength to endure the pace. Someone denounced him, perhaps out of fear, perhaps out of envy, and the news quickly reached the master's ears. Joachim was called to the center of the yard, and before he could even explain himself, he was already surrounded by whips and hostile stares. The overseer announced loudly, "Today this young man will learn that hunger does not grant the right to insolence." The trunko was there, imposing, as if it had been made for that very moment. Joachim tried to argue, but the sound of the wood opening drowned out his voice. The crowd of enslaved people watched, their eyes fixed on the ground, pretending not to see, because seeing too much was dangerous. His arms were pulled brutally, his neck locked into the narrow opening, and within seconds his body no longer belonged to him. The sun seemed to burn hotter at that instant, as if complicit in the punishment. Joachim closed his eyes and thought of the river where, as a child, he would dive until he lost his breath. Now he could barely swallow his own saliva. The hours dragged on. His skin burned, his throat dried, and the wood scraped his flesh with every tiny attempt to move. Joachim begged, "A drop! Just a drop!" But the overseers laughed. One of them brought a bucket full and spilled it on the ground slowly, on purpose. Joachim tried to lunge forward, but the tronco held him still. That was not just punishment. It was calculated torture, designed to crush dignity along with the body. 2 days. That was how long Joachim endured locked inside. When they finally released him, he fell to the ground like a body without a soul. His feet did not respond. His eyes were empty, and his voice no longer had the strength to ask for anything. He survived, but something had remained forever inside that wood. His hope, perhaps. His youth, certainly. The other enslaved people understood the message. The tronco did not only kill the one trapped within it, it killed, in every witness, the courage to resist. But in the heavy silence of that night, someone heard Joachim sing. A faint melody, almost a sigh, but it was music. And in that song, there was a hidden message. Even scarred, even broken, he was still human. The tronco was never just an individual punishment. It was designed as a stage. Placed in plain sight, often at the entrance of the mill, it served as a daily reminder of who truly held power and who was condemned to obey. Passing by it, every enslaved person was forced to look, even if only in passing, at that wood impregnated with sweat, dried blood and tears. It was impossible not to feel the stomach turn at the thought of being trapped there, immobile, at the mercy of thirst and pain. The masters knew that fear was a more faithful ally than the lash. That is why they turned every punishment into a spectacle. They called all the workers to watch, lined up as if they were at a macabre ceremony. Children were brought on purpose, because the overseers believed that the earlier terror entered their eyes, the easier it would be to mold their wills. The elders, who had already seen too much, lowered their heads, but even so were forced to listen. The silence was broken only by the crack of the whip in the air, or by the creak of the wood closing over the victim. It was common for the masters to receive visitors at their farms, travelers, merchants, the curious, and instead of hiding the tronco, they proudly displayed it. "This is how we maintain order," they said, as if it were an exhibition piece, almost a trophy of domination. Human suffering became a spectacle, a constant reminder that in that space there was no law greater than the master's will. Women suffered in a particular way when witnessing this show of horrors. Many cried in silence, hiding their tears so as not to be accused of excessive compassion. The men, in turn, swallowed their anger because even a lingering look could be interpreted as defiance. The tronco, in this way, fulfilled its double role. It destroyed the one who was trapped and terrified those who watched. But there was something the masters did not realize. Every spectacle also left marks that time could not erase. Children grew up remembering the screams, the frozen expressions of pain, the smell of blood mixed with hot earth. That memory became a scar on the soul, a scar that never healed. Decades later, there were still those who closed their eyes and saw with clarity the tronco in the yard, as if time had stopped there. And it was precisely that scar that kept alive the memory of injustice, because as much as the tronco was used to terrify, it also denounced the cruelty of a system that turned pain into a spectacle. No one could forget what they had seen, and that not forgetting, even if silent, was the first seed of resistance. If seeing a man tied to the tronco was already a painful scene, seeing a woman trapped in that wood was like watching a piece of humanity being ripped away by force. Enslaved women were frequent targets of this punishment, not only when they committed some mistake, but often as exemplary punishment to serve as a warning to the whole community. The tronco, in these cases, was used not only to wound, but to humiliate. There were pregnant women forced to kneel before the tronco. Some were locked in ways that left their wombs exposed, vulnerable to heat, cold, and insects. Many lost their children before they were even born, and this loss was treated by the overseers as irrelevant. To them, the child's life had no value, because there were always other women to generate more arms that in the future would also be enslaved. Every tear shed in these situations was not only personal pain, it was the silent cry of an entire people being crushed. Women were also punished for small acts of resistance, hiding food, breastfeeding a baby longer than allowed, speaking softly in an African language. The tronco, in these cases, was a brutal response to minimal acts of care, affection, or preservation of memory. It was as if every demonstration of humanity was considered an affront. One of the most remembered stories in oral accounts is that of Rosa, a young woman, a little over 18 years old, accused of having disrespected a white mistress by not lowering her head during a conversation. Rosa was taken to the tronco in front of everyone. While they tied her, she did not cry, she did not beg. She remained silent, her eyes fixed on the horizon. The overseer poured water on the ground, mocking her thirst. But Rosa did not beg. She stayed still, firm, as if her resistance were greater than her pain itself. Days later, when she was released, she was weak, but still held the same gaze, and that gaze spread among the other enslaved like a hidden flame. The punishment of women in the tronco carried an extra cruelty. The female body was exposed, the dresses torn, the breasts revealed, dignity turned into a spectacle. That public humiliation cut deeper than iron or wood. Many carried forever not only the physical scars, but also the trauma of having been reduced to objects before everyone's eyes. And yet, there was something unbreakable in them. Even marked, even wounded, they were the first to sing to comfort those who suffered. They were the ones who shared the little food, who hid medicinal herbs, who taught their children that there was something beyond the tronco. Brutality could crush the body, but it could not kill the capacity to love. And perhaps it was precisely that love, preserved amid pain, that kept the flame of resistance alive. In the heavy silence of the nights, when the mill seemed asleep, something different could be heard. A low melody, almost a whisper, born from the lips of whoever was trapped in the tronco. The music emerged like a thread of life, a breath between pain and darkness. It was not only song, it was prayer, it was memory, it was resistance. Many believed that music was the only way to escape, even if for a few seconds, from the invisible chains the tronco created. The body was immobilized, but the voice could travel, cross fences, reach the ears of other enslaved people who, upon hearing, felt less alone. Every verse was a reminder that despite the pain, there was an identity that could not be taken away. The songs often came from Africa, kept in the memory of mothers and grandmothers. They were words in dialects that the masters did not understand, but that carried the weight of centuries of tradition. Sung at the tronco, these songs took on another dimension. They became cries for freedom, disguised in soft melodies. Whoever heard them understood the message: resist, survive, wait, because the night will pass. There were also improvised chants created on the spot, descriptions of pain turned into poetry. One prisoner sang about thirst, another about the heat that burned his skin, and suddenly the suffering gained rhythm, as if tamed by a greater force. It was a way of saying, "You can lock my body, but my voice is mine." The overseers hated those songs. They tried to silence them with threats, with blows, but the music always returned. And paradoxically, the more they tried to suffocate it, the stronger it became. Because it was not just sound, it was ritual. Many believed that singing in the tronco was a way of invoking the presence of the ancestors, asking them to be there, invisible, sustaining the heart of the one standing at the edge of despair. One night, they say, a woman named Benedita was locked in the tronco for refusing to hand over a piece of cloth she had hidden. While everyone slept, she began to sing. The melody crossed the entire mill, so soft and at the same time so firm that it made many cry silently inside the slave quarters. The overseer rose in fury, but when he arrived, he found not only Benedita singing, but others, in chorus, quietly joining in. It was impossible to silence. Music then became a weapon. It did not break chains, but it broke fear. It did not free the body, but it freed the mind. The next day, even with fresh marks, the prisoners sang again. And every song, loaded with pain and hope, crossed generations until it reached the present day. Because some melodies never die. They are born in the tronco, but survive in the memory of an entire people. The tronco was not just a wooden prison, it was a psychological weapon. The true power was not only in locking a body, but in locking the minds of all who watched. Every time someone was taken to that structure, the entire community bowed, not by force, but by fear. It was that fear that kept the mill running, even when bodies were already at the brink of collapse. The overseer knew this. He did not need to punish every day. It was enough from time to time to choose a victim and expose them in the tronco so that silence would reign for weeks. The terror was so strong that the enslaved began to police one another, avoiding any gesture that might attract the master's attention. Fear became an invisible guard, far more effective than iron chains. Children learned early. They grew up seeing fathers, mothers, or acquaintances humiliated in front of everyone. They did not need to feel the wood to understand the message. It was enough to hear the screams, see the twisted faces, feel the tension in the air. Thus, the tronco shaped generations molded by forced obedience. It was not just discipline. It was emotional manipulation in its cruelest form. The human mind reacts to fear in two ways, fight or flight. But in the tronco, neither was possible. There was nowhere to run, and resisting only increased the pain. This psychological blockade led many into a state of resignation, of surrender. That was what the masters wanted, not only docile bodies, but souls convinced that there was no way out. There was also the collective humiliation. When seeing someone locked, everyone knew they could not help, and that impotence corroded as much as the chains. The tronco, then, did not only punish the prisoner, but everyone around, because it created the sensation that nothing could be done. Fear spread like smoke, entering the lungs, numbing the spirit, but paradoxically from that very fear was born the spark of resistance. Some, seeing suffering repeated so many times, began to understand that there was nothing left to lose except life itself. And when life no longer had value in the eyes of the masters, only the desire to fight remained. Thus, in the midst of the psychological terror of the tronco, the first gestures of revolt were also born. Because fear can dominate for a time, but never forever. The tronco was not made to give quick lessons. It was designed to last, to prolong pain to the limit of the human body. Many did not endure. Paralyzed muscles began to fail, legs trembled, and blood, trapped by the forced position, made limbs swell until they seemed ready to burst. The skin, in contact with the rough wood and rusty iron, developed open wounds that soon filled with flies. The body became a battlefield between resistance and inevitable collapse. There were those who fainted on the very first day. The intense heat, the thirst, and the hunger were stronger than any courage. When they collapsed, the tronco did not release them. It simply held them there, fallen, heavy, breathing with difficulty like broken dolls. Some were removed in time, but many simply never returned. They died in silence, without honor, before powerless eyes. The overseers had different ways of dealing with death in the tronco. Some threw the body into a common pit without even a cloth for covering. Others left the corpse locked for hours as an explicit warning. This is what happens to those who dare. The smell of decomposition mixed with the hot air, forcing everyone to feel on their skin that the life of an enslaved person was worth less than the wood that bound them. There were, however, those who resisted beyond the imaginable. Men and women who spent entire days under sun and rain, without food, without water, and yet still managed to open their eyes when they were released. The body came out in pieces, but the mind, even broken, still kept the instinct to survive. These survivors carried scars that never closed, both on the skin and on the soul. They became living witnesses that the tronco was worse than death. The children who saw someone die in the tronco carried that memory for life. They grew up with the sound of screams echoing in their ears and with the image of the fallen body engraved in their eyes. That memory turned into nightmare, and the nightmare turned into fear. Fear, in turn, became an invisible chain stronger than any iron. But there was also an unexpected effect. For some, seeing death up close awakened a certainty. There was nothing left to lose. If life could be ripped away so cruelly, perhaps it was better to risk everything in an escape, in a rebellion, in an attempt at resistance. And so, paradoxically, the tronco, created to crush, sometimes gave birth to courage. A desperate courage, it is true, but courage nonetheless. The tronco was not the only instrument of punishment. In the machinery of slavery, there was a variety of penalties, each designed to hurt in a different way. There was the lash, for example, which cut the skin until the raw flesh was exposed. The crack in the air was enough to make any heart race. The whip hurt, but it passed. The tronco did not. It prolonged the agony, turned minutes into days, days into eternity. Another torment was the iron mask, a heavy structure placed on the enslaved person's face, preventing them from eating, from speaking, from expressing themselves. Often it came with a small bell attached to the top, which rang with every movement, denouncing the punished person's presence. The mask silenced, but still allowed walking. The tronco gave no choice. It was total immobilization, the body exposed as spectacle. There was also the pillory, the ultimate symbol of public humiliation. There, punishments were applied before the entire community, often in the central squares of towns. Whoever was whipped at the pillory had their pain amplified by the gazes, by the comments, by the laughter of those watching. But the pillory was temporary. It ended when the executioner decided. The tronco, on the other hand, continued even after the overseers left, because the pain did not cease. Time was the executioner. Some masters resorted to heavy chains, shackles on the feet, ankle irons that caused deep wounds. Others punished with deprivation of food, forcing the enslaved to work in absolute fasting. There were even punishments that involved fire, salt thrown into wounds, anthills used as instruments of torment. But among them all, the tronco stood out for one reason. It combined physical pain, public humiliation, and psychological destruction in a single act. Many scholars affirm that the tronco was the most complete punishment of slavery, complete in the cruelest sense. It did not only punish, it shaped the community around it. Every time someone was locked in, everyone felt as if they too were in the tronco. And this collective effect made it even more feared than the lash or the iron mask. And yet, there was one similarity among all these punishments. None of them managed to completely erase the humanity of those who suffered. The body could be marked, the face could be hidden, the voice could be silenced, but memory, faith, and hope remained. And perhaps that was what most irritated the masters, realizing that despite the entire arsenal of cruelty, there always remained something they could not dominate. Today, when we see the trunko displayed in museums or preserved in old farms, it seems like just a wooden object, silent and still. But for those who know its history, it speaks loudly. Every crack, every split, every dark stain is testimony of lives scarred by pain. It's not just a piece of the past. It is a symbol of everything slavery represented in terms of brutality and dehumanization. Foreign travelers who were in Brazil during the centuries of slavery wrote about the tronco in their diaries. Some were horrified by the cruelty they witnessed, describing it as the most diabolical invention ever used against human beings. Others, unfortunately, reported it with coldness, as if it were a natural part of the order of things. These records, even when insensitive, became undeniable proof of the barbarity that happened before complicit and indifferent eyes. In communities descended from the enslaved, the trunko still lives in oral memory. Grandparents tell children that their great-grandparents knew that instrument up close, that they heard the screams, or that they carried on their bodies the marks of the wood. It is a collective trauma that crosses generations, because it is not only about remembering the physical pain, but about recognizing that it was used as a weapon to destroy identities, families, and dreams. The trunko also became a symbol of resistance. At the same time that it recalls violence, it denounces injustice and prevents history from being erased. Every time someone comes across it in an exhibition or in a photograph, they are forced to face the cruelest side of humanity. It is a necessary shock, because memory is the only way to prevent horrors like that from happening again. And perhaps that is precisely the role of the tronko today, not to let us forget. It no longer locks bodies, but it locks consciences, forcing us to reflect on the weight of slavery and its consequences that still echo in the present. As long as memory exists, the tronko will not be just a piece of wood, but a mirror, an uncomfortable mirror that forces us to ask, how far can human cruelty go? The tronko no longer exists as an instrument of torture. The wood that once locked bodies now rests in museums, in the ruins of mills, or in the memory of those who still carry inherited scars. But what it represented remains alive, because it was never just a piece of wood. It was the embodiment of power that turned people into things, lives into objects, dignity into spectacle. The tronko was more than a punishment. It was a message engraved on the body of those who endured it and in the mind of those who had to watch. Every muffled scream, every denied request for water, every tear that fell on dry earth did not disappear. Those memories echoed through the slave quarters, crossed generations, and reached us. Today, when we look back, it is impossible not to feel indignation. It is impossible not to ask, how was it possible? How could human beings invent such a cruel torment and still take pride in it as if it were a sign of order and progress? The tronko forces us to reflect. It reminds us that slavery was not just forced labor. It was the systematization of cruelty. It was the invention of calculated forms of pain to keep an entire people subdued. And at the same time, the tronko also reminds us of resistance. Because even crushed, those men and women did not allow themselves to be erased. They sang, they prayed, they looked to the horizon, they kept memory alive. They turned silence into a cry, humiliation into testimony, pain into a legacy of struggle. And here is where history meets you, because the tronko is not just the past. It is a mirror that asks, What are today's troncos? Where do thirst, humiliation, and oppression still exist? Who is still being silenced before our eyes? The echo of that instrument continues to resound, and it is up to us to decide whether we will ignore it or whether we will have the courage to face its message. Now I ask you, do you believe this really happened? Can you imagine the thirst, the humiliation, the silence turned into spectacle? If this story touched you, it is because it needed to reach you. Leave your comment, share this memory, and subscribe to the channel, but only if you have the courage to look at the past and not turn your eyes away from the truth.